So we're going to start off this video here about my 2011 Mercedes-Benz E550 4MATIC versus my old Hyundai Genesis 2012 Hyundai Genesis 5.0 R spec. So I want to start out here. I've owned both these vehicles. This was the almost exact vehicle of what I've owned before, minus that little side stripe there, and my rims were all blacked out. But I own that vehicle. I had some Genesis badges on there and in the back. And I do have to say I like this car a lot. And actually we are going to start out with the Genesis here. And I mean, who doesn't love that look? It was a rounded off car. It looked a little bit like the S-Class. It took a lot of cues from the S-Class. Actually, it had a longer nose, and it fit right in with a lot of German competitors, similar to like the E-Class or the A6, S6 from Audi, and cars like that of that luxury trim luxury line, Cadillac CTS, when the update hit, cars like that. So let's first start off with the Genesis here. I just want to come off with some specs here. So the Genesis had an 8-speed Shiftronic automatic transmission. It was okay. It wasn't great. I compare it to the Mercedes-Benz in eco mode right now. It was just there, it was great for fuel economy. I just feel like with that much power in that engine, it was missing out on some key, transmission shifts and maybe some gearing as well. So now we move to the engine here. The horsepower was 430 at 6,400 RPM, and the torque 376, a decent amount. Coming on at 5,000 RPMs. 300 of that came on at 1,500 RPMs. So it was a pretty torquey machine. Although the 0 to 60 was 4.8 as low as I saw. This says 4.93. I've seen it as low as 4.8. And it was rear-wheel drive as well. So, it was a great engine. It just didn't have that bark that I was expected. Anyway, it didn't have that bark that I expected that a 5-liter, V8 should have. And that had to do a little bit with the exhaust system. It was a very quiet car, something you would expect out of the 5.0 instead of the 5.0 R spec. They could have definitely gave it a much better exhaust on there. But with that being said, of course, I said it's an 8-speed Shiftronic automatic transmission. You could shift it, although I never shifted it. I just left it in auto. There really wasn't much to shift with it. And when you did get it up higher in the rev range, it almost sounded like a VTEC sensation rather than a V8. So final drive axle was 3.53. This is, of course, all the gear ratios. So let's talk about the suspension here. So I want to hit the tires. So my car was actually fitted with 245s on it. 245, 45 R19s. I do have to say those were okay. The Mercedes was fitted with 255s on there. I thought to put all that power down, you would need at least 240 or 255s on that car. Quite often was I searching for traction even on a dry road, and that could have been the tires that I had on it. But I was searching for traction quite often. You do want a car that can do a nasty burnout, but you do want a car that can also have traction as well. And personally, I'd rather have the traction. So I was not impressed with the tire size of the vehicle. And The suspension here, they were Sachs dampers. You could not adjust the suspension from Eco to Sport or Sport Plus or whatever cars had of that time. You could only leave it in its normal mode. But I do have to say, that suspension, it was 30% stiffer than the regular Genesis 5.0, and it was actually dampened pretty nice. I really like the suspension there. I wish Mercedes would have just put a spring coil suspension on their vehicle instead of the Airmatic. I don't mind the Airmatic. I do like it, although I thought that the Genesis in its regular suspension setup with those Sachs dampers was better than the Mercedes-Benz and the Airmatic Sport. Although I do have a lot more grip with the 4MATIC and the all-wheel drive system along with the tires, so I feel a lot more settled in the Mercedes, like I could take corners better than the Genesis, although I liked how the Genesis rode better. It was a sportier feel to it. So the weight of the Genesis was 4154. The fuel tank was 20 gallons. So if we look at the E550 here, this is where we're going to see a lot of similarities here. The fuel tank is about the same. The weight of the vehicle, 4145. Very similar to that 4154, just change the 4 and a 5. So they basically weigh the same. I mean, they basically are perfectly the same. And the exterior length of the Genesis was 196.30 compared to the 191.7 inches of the Mercedes. But let's pay attention to the wheelbase here. So we had 113 inches for the Mercedes compared to 115 inches. So 2 inches longer wheelbase on the Genesis. And if we look at the turning circle, we can definitely see here, yes, that the Mercedes steers very, very sharply. And that's one thing I do have to say. The Mercedes is sharp. Not a lot of understeer, not a lot of oversteer. The Genesis had a lot of understeer to it because it was such a big vehicle. And if we look at the front track and the rear track, they're right around 63 inches. And if we can try to find this information here on the Mercedes, we will see that the Mercedes is a little bit more narrow. And I actually want to find this information out here. So we're going to look it up. 2011 Mercedes E550 sedan track width. So again, we're going to take a look here. The E550. Try to go on something a little bit better of a website. I don't know who would ever want to tow with that. Okay, here we go. So the wheelbase, we got the front track of 62 and 62. So you could definitely tell that the Genesis was wider, even though it was an inch wider. I have to say I enjoyed driving the Genesis a lot more than the Mercedes driving it. Now, I do have to say that the Mercedes feels a lot smaller than the Genesis does. And that's just the design of it, just the steering of it. But I did enjoy driving that bigger car, and I think the next car I want to get is going to be a big car as well. But the E550 drives a lot smaller than what it is. You know, they weigh the same. The Genesis is a little bit longer. You can definitely tell that Genesis is a big car driving it. I mean, there's no getting around that. It was big. The E-Class was definitely smaller feeling. You could almost compare it to a C-Class, really. It definitely feels the smaller out of the two. If we keep going on the specs here, with the Mercedes. The Mercedes has the last year of the 5.5 liter V8 with 382 horsepower and 391 foot-pounds torque. Both these numbers come on, well, the foot-pound torque comes on pretty low, although the 382, of course, you got to get it higher up in the rev range. That engine, for having less horsepower but more torque, this is the faster car. This is the faster car off the line. This is the faster car in the top end. 0 to 60 is 4.6 to 4.8. And I do have to say it is noticeable. It is responsive. You know, with the Genesis, when you floor it, you have to wait a little bit for that transmission to shift. If you put the Mercedes in sport mode, you don't have to wait as long. It's still not like a ZF of today, and it is 7 speeds with overdrive, but this is definitely the more responsive car to drive. That is for sure. Now with that, that's the fuel economy, city highway combined. You know, I did take a road trip with it. I was getting about 24. You're going an average of 66 miles an hour over the course of that road trip, a 4-hour road trip. The Genesis definitely got better gas mileage by 2 to 3 to 4 MPG points there when I would take a similar trip. And that's just thanks to that 8-speed along with the 8-speed transmission as well. Oh, we got our little helper here, Eleanor. Again, you know, just some more specs. I do have to say, I have the 18-inch silver AMG wheels. I'm glad it's got 18-inch instead of the 19s as well. It's a little bit easier to shop for, and the ride is just a little bit better. The interior of both vehicles, now, don't get me wrong, the Genesis was excellent. I mean, the Genesis had everything you needed in a car, basically. You got adaptive cruise, and this was all standard, mind you, at 50,000, give or take. So you got adaptive cruise control, you had heated and cooled driver's seat, heated passenger seat, heated rear seats, no adaptive high beams, but the lights your headlights would move as you would turn, so adaptive headlights there, rain sensing wipers, a backup camera with rear and front sensors on the vehicle, and a sunroof as well, and peasant blockers for the back. And there might be some features that I'm missing, and a very, very nice simple infotainment feature, and it really set Hyundai up for success in the future. With that being said, and the seats were comfy, they were very couch-like, the steering wheel sucked. With that being said, you know, that was $20,000 to $25,000 cheaper than a relatively spec'd E550. And my E550, although you can get it in its base form or its optioned out form, I have everything that the Genesis has along with massaging seats, except the adaptive cruise control group, and I believe that was a separate option that mine didn't come with. The Genesis did have a 17-speaker Lexicon sound system, which is still the best sound system I have ever heard in a vehicle. This Mercedes has a Harman Kardon Logic 7, which is probably the second or third best I've ever heard in a vehicle, maybe the third. But the Genesis definitely had the better sound group there. So far, so good with repair and maintenance on both of them. But overall, the Genesis had an awesome interior. The back seats were comfortable. The front seats were okay. They were like couches, basically. There was no side bolstering, no nothing on them. The bottom seat got a little tiresome after a while. But the Mercedes-Benz interior is definitely put together better. Genesis did a fair deal of using cheaper parts to make the interior, but they found a way to really make it work off well for them. Mercedes just used higher quality parts, and it shows in the interior, and the interior is second to none in that Mercedes. I mean, that's a tough one to compare. I mean, you know what you're going to get with a Mercedes. You're going to get a top quality interior, and that's what you're getting. So that's a tough one for the Genesis to win there. But driving the vehicle, there's nothing like driving a full-size V8 sedan, and that's what that Genesis was, that the Mercedes just doesn't quite give you. Now, props to the Mercedes for making it feel smaller than what it actually is, and then capitalizing on it. And the Genesis didn't quite do that, but it was a little bit bigger as well. And that has to do with a lot of things. That has to do with the rear-wheel drive. It has to do with the transmission. It has to do with the steering for sure, the tires that it was used. The Mercedes was just set up more for performance. Although the Genesis was more fun to drive, I should say. And the only reason I say that, it was because of those Sachs dampers that it had on there and just its bigger nature. I mean, it was the Dodge Charger Chrysler 300 of South Korea, basically. So with that being said, I hope I covered everything here pretty in depth in this video. If you have any questions, just drop them in the comments. I'll try to answer them. If you want my opinion on which one I would buy new, and even like today, I would buy a Genesis product, hands down. They're cheaper. They offer more for your money than going out and buying a Mercedes or a BMW. But if you're asking me what I would buy used between the two, as long as you do your homework with both, I'm not saying with just the Mercedes, with both. There are problems with every car, especially these two, these performance sedans. If it's a clean Mercedes, all the paperwork you have on it is okay, I would definitely choose the E550 over the Genesis 5.0R spec.